Ayo, back at it again with another video. Thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it. So, there are currently four power conferences: the Big Ten, the SEC, the Big 12, and the ACC. So, here's my next four expansion candidates for each of the four power conferences. So, for the Big Ten and the SEC, we have 8 teams moving out of the ACC into either the SEC or the Big 12. The Big 12 picks up a couple from the American, Mountain West or Pac 12, and Sun Belt. So let's kind of go through first and foremost the Big Ten. The Big Ten, if you look at their expansion, is mostly for TV markets, TV eyeballs. If you're the Big Ten, you have 3 media partners. You have Fox, which is your primary media partner. You got CBS and NBC. So you have 3 mouths to feed when it comes to your media partners. The SEC only has one. They're with ESPN. I think the Big Ten and the SEC do expand next go around. However, I think it's for very different reasons. I think the Big Ten is looking for brands, and I think the SEC is looking for states. So the Big Ten picks up Florida State, Clemson, Georgia Tech, Miami. Those are your 4 really big brands for football viewership in the ACC. Florida State and Clemson are pretty obvious in terms of football viewership. Georgia Tech is a little less obvious, but they have a really good ratings game every year consistently with Georgia Tech versus Georgia. And then Miami. Miami makes a lot of sense for media market as well. Miami is big. The Big Ten, I think, is looking for media markets and TV viewership. And these are the 4 from the ACC that really get you that. The SEC, I think, is wanting to expand, but I think they are wanting to expand more for regionality. In the past, the SEC has expanded on 2 fronts. One, either really good at football or really expands their regional footprint. For example, 2010s expanded their footprint, got into Texas with Texas A&M, got into Missouri with Missouri. And then in 2020, in early 2020s, you got Texas and Oklahoma, and that expanded your footprint, but was more focused on football. For the SEC, I think next expansion go around, I think they're focused on the states of Virginia and North Carolina. You take Virginia, North Carolina, Virginia Tech, and NC State. You're currently at 16 in the SEC. You get up to 20. You expand into 2 more media markets. You're pretty much all where you really want to be across the entire Southeast, from Texas all the way to Florida, all the way up into North Carolina and Virginia. So 17 and 18 are Virginia and North Carolina, 19 and 20 Virginia Tech and NC State. For the Big 12, I think their expansion is different. I think they have to really focus on football. The Big 12 has done a really great job at expanding in terms of basketball, especially when you add Arizona from the 4 corner schools and then Houston from the American last go around. I do think the Big 12 should focus more on football this specific go around, because especially if you're trying to get a bigger media deal, football is the driver of that. So who are your power brands from the G6 ranks? I think Memphis makes a lot of sense. Personally, I think Memphis should already be in the Big 12. The Big 12, I think, should have accepted Memphis's offer, but that's not my decision to make. So I think Memphis makes a lot of sense. South Florida Bulls mix with UCF, Central Florida, the Knights and the Bulls, I think makes a lot of sense. Boise State doesn't really get you a whole lot of media market in terms of Idaho, but Boise State really is solid at football, especially if you can bring in a really solid football brand like Boise State. Imagine the ratings for Boise State versus a Texas Tech or any one of these very prominent Big 12 football brands. And the last one, I think, is James Madison. I think it makes a lot of sense, especially if you don't get a whole lot of, teams from the ACC coming over to the Big 12. I think you definitely need to get into that Mid-Atlantic media market. James Madison is in Virginia. So the ACC, I think the ACC survives to a certain extent, but I think the ACC is looking more to kind of expand with teams in more private schools, or in UConn's case, a public university, but kind of acts like a private university, if that makes any sense. So Tulane makes a lot of sense. Rice makes a lot of sense, especially if you're the ACC. You get into Louisiana, you get further into the state of Texas. You need some travel partners for SMU. I think Tulsa is another one that makes a lot of sense, kind of fill out the middle of the map a little bit more for the ACC. And I think UConn makes a lot of sense, especially for basketball. If you're the ACC, you have a lot of really solid basketball brands, and if you can add UConn to that, I think that makes a lot of sense. You're probably losing North Carolina. There's been reports that North Carolina wants to go to the SEC. So if you lose North Carolina, you already have Duke. Louisville's a really solid basketball brand. Syracuse is a good basketball brand. I think if you add UConn to that rotation, to that lineup of ACC schools, I think that makes a lot of sense. So basketball is the reason for UConn, and then I think the ACC is more focused on private schools. So I added Tulsa, I added Rice, and I added Tulane. So these are my next 4 choices for each of the Power 4 conferences. I think the Big Ten expands for TV viewership. I think the SEC expands for regionality in their markets, especially into Virginia and North Carolina. I think the Big 12 probably expands more for football. They need a bigger media package, media rights deal, and I think the ACC is trying to expand more towards private schools that kind of fit what the ACC is kind of going for, and then you have UConn, which fits for basketball. I think if you add Tulane, Rice, and Tulsa, that kind of fills out a little bit more of the map better for the ACC. So these are my next 4 schools for each of the Power 4 conferences. The Big Ten takes Florida State, Clemson, Georgia Tech, and Miami for TV viewership. I think the SEC expands into Virginia, North Carolina, Virginia Tech, North Carolina State for regionality, and I think the Big 12 expands for football, and the ACC is expanding just to survive. So each conference has their own motives, and these are my next 4 for the Power 4 conferences. I'm probably going to do the next 6 for the G6 conferences. So this is my next 4 for the Power 4. With that, that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Deuces.